"We need airport security at gate 14, immediately." The senior flight attendant's voice crackled over the radio, her eyes locked onto Charlotte with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. Around him, the wealthy elite of the business class cabin whispered, their manicured hands shielding cruel smiles. Charlotte sat quietly in seat 2A, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had paid for this seat. He belonged here. But in the eyes of Beatrice Gallagher, a black man in a faded college hoodie was a trespasser who needed to be removed. She thought she was publicly putting a nobody in his place. She had absolutely no idea she was about to detonate her entire career. The ambient hum of London Heathrow's Terminal 5 was a white noise that usually put Charlotte Pendleton at ease. At 42, Charlotte was a highly sought-after structural engineer whose firm had designed some of the most resilient modern skyscrapers in the Western Hemisphere. He spent half his life in the sky, crossing the Atlantic so often that the pressurized cabins felt like a second home. Yet, despite his millions and his frequent flyer status, he despised the performative wealth of travel. Today, Charlotte was dressed for comfort. It had been a grueling 2-week consultation in Dubai, followed by a tense stopover in London. He wore a pair of well-tailored but relaxed dark jeans, pristine white sneakers, and a faded, oversized gray Yale hoodie, a memento from his late father. He looked like a tired man heading home to New York on Meridian Airlines Flight 402. He did not look like the stereotypical occupant of a $10,000 transcontinental business class pod. His wife, Catherine, was supposed to be boarding with him. However, a sudden crisis involving a supply chain collapse had kept her anchored in the first-class lounge, barking orders into her phone. "Go ahead, my love," Catherine had told him, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. "I'll be right behind you. Save me some of those warm mixed nuts." Charlotte had smiled, gathered his carry-on duffel, and made his way to the priority boarding lane. The gate agent had scanned his digital boarding pass without a second glance, offering a polite, "Welcome back, Mr. Pendleton." The trouble began the moment his foot crossed the threshold of the aircraft. Standing at the entrance of the business-class cabin was Beatrice Gallagher. Beatrice was a veteran purser, a woman in her late 50s, whose tightly pinned blonde chignon and perfectly applied crimson lipstick gave her an air of rigid, unyielding authority. She had worked for Meridian Airlines for 25 years, and over those decades, she had cultivated a very specific, deeply prejudiced mental catalog of who belonged in her cabin and who did not. As Charlotte stepped onto the plane, Beatrice's smile, which had been beaming at a white corporate executive just seconds prior, vanished instantly. Her eyes swept over his faded hoodie, his exhausted face, and the simple canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Her posture stiffened. "Excuse me, sir," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine sweetness that masked condescension. She stepped directly into his path, physically blocking his entry into the aisle. "Economy and premium economy boarding hasn't commenced yet. Furthermore, your cabin is located through the galley and straight to the rear of the aircraft." Charlotte paused, offering a tired but polite smile. He was no stranger to this. The microaggressions, the assumptions, the quiet profiling. It was a tax he had paid his entire life, regardless of how much money sat in his bank accounts. "I'm in 2A, Charlotte replied, his voice calm and resonant. He gestured toward the port side of the aircraft. "Just right over there." Beatrice did not move. Her eyes narrowed, the crimson lips pressing into a thin, skeptical line. "Sir, I highly doubt that. May I see your boarding pass?" Charlotte pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the airline app, and held the screen toward her. The bright digital display clearly showed Charlotte Pendleton, Flight MA 402, Seat 2A, Group UN. Beatrice stared at the screen for a moment too long. A flicker of annoyance crossed her features, as if the digital ink were lying to her. She didn't apologize. She didn't offer a welcoming greeting. Instead, she let out a short, dismissive breath and stepped aside just enough for him to squeeze past. "Make sure your bag goes completely into the overhead," she muttered, not looking at him. Charlotte shook his head slightly, deciding not to engage, and made his way to seat 2A. The business class pod was a haven of polished wood, brushed aluminum, and plush leather. He stowed his duffel, sank into the seat, and let out a long sigh, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. He just wanted to sleep. A few minutes later, the pre-flight beverage service began. A younger, eager flight attendant named Simon pushed the cart down the aisle, offering flutes of champagne and crystal glasses of sparkling water. Beatrice was shadowing him, directing him like a hawk. When Simon reached row 2, he smiled at the passenger in 2B, a ruddy-faced, wealthy-looking man in a sharp, bespoke suit. "Champagne, mister." "Bridget?" "Thank you, Simon." The man, Richard Bridget, replied with a posh, booming voice. Simon then turned toward Charlotte. "And for you, S." "Skip him, Simon," Beatrice interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She placed a hand on Simon's forearm, physically stopping him from handing Charlotte a glass. "We need to conserve the vintage for the ticketed passengers. I'm still verifying the manifest." Simon blinked, looking confused and slightly embarrassed, but he lacked the spine to challenge the senior purser. He awkwardly pulled the tray back and hurried down the aisle. Charlotte sat frozen. The blatant disrespect was no longer subtle, it was public. He could feel the eyes of Richard Bridget in 2B darting toward him, assessing him, judging him. The humiliation started as a slow burn in Charlotte's chest, a familiar, agonizing heat. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of who he was. He would not let a bitter flight attendant ruin his peace, but Beatrice, it seemed, was only just getting started. 10 minutes passed. The cabin was filling up with the rustle of expensive coats and the quiet hum of privileged conversation. Charlotte had taken out his noise-canceling headphones, intending to block out the world, when a sharp tap on his shoulder startled him. He pulled one headphone off. Beatrice was standing over him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her waist. Her face was a mask of aggressive customer service. "Sir, I need you to gather your things," she said, projecting her voice just enough so the surrounding rows could hear. Charlotte furrowed his brow. "Excuse me? I've checked the passenger manifest," Beatrice lied, her tone clipped and authoritative. "There has been an error in the ticketing system. This seat is reserved for a high-tier executive member. I need you to relocate to your actual seat in the main cabin before I am forced to hold up the departure." Charlotte stared at her, the audacity of the lie temporarily stunning him. He had watched Catherine book these tickets herself. They were confirmed. They were paid for. "There is no error," Charlotte said, his voice remaining remarkably steady. "My name is Charlotte Pendleton. I am ticketed for 2A. My wife is ticketed for 2C. She will be boarding momentarily. I suggest you check your manifest again." Richard Bridget, the man across the aisle, let out an exasperated sigh, rustling his financial newspaper. "Good Lord," Bridget muttered loudly to nobody in particular. "If there's a ticketing issue, just move to the back, mate. Some of us have important meetings in New York and don't wish to be delayed by stowaways playing the system." A few other passengers murmured in agreement. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, turning hostile, turning against the lone black man in the hoodie. They looked at his clothes. They looked at his skin. They drew their conclusions, aided and abetted by Beatrice's performance. Beatrice's chest puffed up with the validation of the other passengers. She leaned in closer, dropping the fake customer service voice for a low, venomous whisper. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed. "I know how this works. You found a boarding pass, or a gate agent made a foolish mistake, but I run this cabin. Meridian Airlines caters to a specific clientele in this section. You are making my actual passengers uncomfortable. Now, you can walk back to economy with whatever dignity you have left, or I can have you removed from this aircraft entirely." Charlotte's blood ran cold, but his mind went incredibly sharp. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. He knew the trap that was being set for him. The moment he displayed an ounce of anger, he would become the angry, aggressive black man, giving her all the justification she needed to call the police. "I am not moving," Charlotte said. his voice low, firm, and crystal clear. "I paid for this seat. I am perfectly within my rights to sit here. If you have an issue with my presence, bring the captain out here to speak with me. But do not speak to me like a criminal again." Beatrice's face flushed an ugly, mottled red. She was not used to being defied, especially not by someone she deemed so profoundly beneath her. Her authority was her shield, and Charlotte had just pierced straight through it. "Simon!" Beatrice snapped, turning on her heel. The younger flight attendant scurried over from the galley, looking terrified. "Stand here and watch this man," Beatrice commanded, pointing a manicured finger at Charlotte as if he were a caged animal. "Ensure he does not touch anything else in this pod. If he tries to move anywhere but the rear of the plane, shout for me." Are you sure?" Simon whispered nervously, glancing at Charlotte's calm, stoic expression. His pass scanned green at the gate. "Do not question me, Simon," she barked. "He is being belligerent and refusing crew instructions. I am calling the ground manager and security." She marched back to the forward galley, snatching the intercom phone off its cradle. The curtain remained slightly open, allowing Charlotte and the rest of the first few rows to hear her side of the conversation. "Gate 14. This is Purser Gallagher. I have a situation in business class, seat 2A. A passenger has fraudulently occupied a premium seat and is becoming hostile and aggressive when asked to produce valid documentation. Yes, he is refusing crew instructions. I feel threatened. I need airport security on board immediately to escort him off the aircraft." Charlotte closed his eyes. The words hostile, aggressive, and threatened hung in the air like toxic smoke. They were buzzwords, weaponized words designed to trigger a heavy-handed police response. He felt a profound, exhausting sadness wash over him. He had built skyscrapers. He employed hundreds of people. He was a loving husband and a law-abiding man. But here, in the manufactured hierarchy of an airplane tube, he was nothing but a stereotype in a hoodie to a woman who hated him on sight. "It's disgraceful," a woman in row 3 whispered loudly to her husband, trying to steal a seat and then threatening the poor crew. Charlotte slowly opened his eyes and looked at Simon, who was standing awkwardly in the aisle, literally standing guard over him. "Simon," Charlotte said quietly, "do I look aggressive to you?" Simon swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. "Sir, please. Just don't say anything. Just wait for security." 5 minutes passed. The boarding process had completely halted. The captain had made a vague announcement about a minor security delay, causing a collective groan to ripple through the cabin. Charlotte sat perfectly still. He placed his hands flat on his armrests, palms up, ensuring everyone could see he was not a threat. He was preparing himself mentally for the humiliation of armed officers marching down the aisle to question him. Heavy footsteps echoed on the metal grating of the jet bridge. Beatrice emerged from the galley, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face. Trailing behind her were 2 Heathrow Airport security officers in high-visibility vests, followed closely by a red-faced gate agent. "There he is," Beatrice said, pointing dramatically at Charlotte. "He's refused multiple orders to vacate the premium cabin. I want him off my flight. He is a security risk." The lead officer, a burly man named Davis, approached row 2. He placed a hand on his radio. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and bring your belongings. We need to step off the aircraft to have a chat." "Officer," Charlotte said, keeping his voice perfectly level, "I am ticketed for this seat. I have shown the flight attendant my digital pass. I have not raised my voice, nor have I refused any lawful instruction. I am being harassed." Richard Bridget scoffed loudly. "Oh, please! Officer, the man has been holding up the entire flight. Just drag him out so we can take off." "He's clearly unhinged." "Sir, stand up now," Officer Davis commanded, his tone hardening. He stepped into the aisle, his hand moving toward his utility belt. "If you refuse to leave the aircraft voluntarily, we will use force. This is your final warning." Beatrice crossed her arms, her eyes gleaming with vindictive pleasure. "You should have just walked to the back when I told you to," she mocked softly. Charlotte felt the injustice burning in his throat. He looked at the officers, at Beatrice, at the sneering passengers. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He was not going to give them the satisfaction of a physical altercation. He would fight this in the boardroom, with lawyers, where he held the real power. He gripped the handle of his duffel bag and began to rise. "Excuse me." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense, heavy atmosphere of the cabin like a scythe. It was a crisp, distinctly aristocratic voice, laced with absolute, chilling authority. Everyone, the officers, Beatrice, Simon, and the gawking passengers, turned toward the aircraft door. Standing in the entryway was Catherine Sinclair Pendleton. She was a vision of terrifying elegance. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal Alexander McQueen pantsuit, a silk blouse, and carrying a matte black Birkin bag, she exuded the kind of wealth that didn't need to shout. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style, and her piercing green eyes were currently scanning the scene with the cold calculation of a predator. Catherine wasn't just wealthy. 3 weeks ago, following a massive corporate acquisition, the Sinclair Pendleton Investment Group had purchased a 70% controlling stake in Meridian Airlines' parent company. Catherine was the newly appointed chairwoman of the board. The paperwork had cleared yesterday. Her face hadn't made it to the internal employee newsletters yet, but her name was practically inscribed on the engines of the plane they were sitting in. Catherine's eyes locked onto her husband, noting the security officers standing over him and the tense set of his jaw. Her expression darkened, a terrifying storm gathering in her gaze. She stepped into the cabin, the sharp click of her Louboutin heels echoing loudly in the sudden silence. "I leave you alone for 20 minutes, Charlotte," Catherine said, her voice dripping with dangerous silk. "And it seems you've made a host of new friends." Beatrice stepped forward, putting on her customer service smile, though she looked slightly intimidated by Catherine's aura. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Boarding is currently halted due to a security incident. I must ask you to wait in the jet bridge." Catherine slowly turned her head to look at Beatrice. She didn't look at her like a person. She looked at her like a stain on the upholstery. "A security incident," Catherine repeated, tasting the words. She looked at the officers. "And what, precisely, is the nature of this incident?" Officer Davis cleared his throat. "Ma'am, please step back. This passenger has refused crew instructions and is occupying a seat he doesn't hold a ticket for." Catherine let out a short, hollow laugh that held zero humor. "Is that so?" She walked directly past the officers, ignoring them completely, and stopped right next to Beatrice. "Tell me, flight attendant," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Did you actually scan his boarding pass? Or did you just look at his skin, look at his sweatshirt, and decide he didn't belong in your pristine little cabin?" Beatrice recoiled, her face turning crimson. "How dare you! I am a senior purser. That is a disgusting accusation. I am simply enforcing company policy. Now return to the jet bridge before I have you removed as well." Catherine didn't blink. She reached into her blazer, pulled out her phone, and tapped a few buttons. "My name," Catherine said, projecting her voice so that every single person in business class could hear her, "is Catherine Sinclair Pendleton. And this man you are attempting to violently drag off this aircraft is Charlotte Pendleton, my husband." A collective gasp swept through the nearby rows. Richard Bridget's jaw actually dropped, his eyes darting between Charlotte's worn hoodie and Catherine's designer suit. Beatrice's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, but she rallied, her pride blinding her. "I don't care who you are, or who you're married to. He doesn't have a ticket for business class, and his behavior is unacceptable." Catherine smiled. It was a terrifying, feral thing. "Oh, Beatrice," she purred, reading the name tag pinned to the purser's chest. "You really should read the company memos, because not only does my husband have a ticket for seat 2A." Catherine took a deliberate step forward, forcing Beatrice to take a step back until she bumped into the galley partition. "He happens to be married to the woman who bought this entire airline yesterday." The silence that followed Catherine's declaration was absolute. It was not merely the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a sudden, suffocating vacuum in the pressurized cabin of Meridian Airlines Flight 402. The ambient hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit seemed to amplify the sheer disbelief radiating from every passenger in business class. For a span of 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Officer Davis's hand hovered awkwardly near his utility belt. The wealthy passengers who had previously sneered at Charlotte were suddenly frozen, their champagne flutes suspended in midair. Beatrice Gallagher blinked rapidly. Her mind, rigidly programmed by decades of systemic bias and unchallenged authority, violently rejected the information. To her, Power looked like Richard Bridget in 2B with his bespoke suit. Power did not look like Charlotte Pendleton in a faded Yale hoodie, and it certainly did not look like a black man quietly enduring a public dressing down. That is an absurd lie, Beatrice stammered, though her voice lacked its previous venom. A tremor of genuine uncertainty had cracked her polished facade. She looked frantically from Catherine's cold, imperial stare to Charlotte's calm demeanor. "Officer, arrest this woman for interfering with a flight crew. They are clearly working together to disrupt this flight." Officer Davis, however, was not an idiot. He had spent years working security at London Heathrow, dealing with international diplomats, foreign royalty, and ultra-high net worth individuals. He recognized the aura of untouchable wealth when he saw it. Catherine's Alexander McQueen suit was immaculate, but it was the absolute, terrifying stillness in her posture that made him slowly lower his hand from his belt. "Ma'am," Davis said cautiously, addressing Catherine, "do you have identification to verify this claim?" Catherine didn't break eye contact with Beatrice. Slowly, she reached into her Birkin bag, withdrawing a sleek, black carbon fiber card case. She extracted her passport and a heavy, matte gold corporate identification card, holding them out to the officer without looking at him. As Davis inspected the documents, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the jet bridge. "Wait! Hold the officers! Stand down!" Bursting through the aircraft door was Gregory Pierce, the senior ground operations manager for Terminal 5. He was a man usually known for his impeccable composure, but right now, his tie was askew, his face was pale, and he was gasping for air. Clutched in his trembling hand was an iPad displaying an urgent corporate memo that had been blasted to all senior management just 20 minutes prior. Gregory shoved past the red-faced gate agent and nearly collided with Officer Davis. He took one look at Charlotte sitting in 2A, and then his eyes snapped to Catherine. All the blood drained from Gregory's face. "Mrs. Sinclair Pendleton," Gregory gasped, practically folding himself in half with a deep, deferential bow. I am so profoundly sorry. I was at the opposite end of the terminal when the automated alert flashed that your boarding passes were flagged at the gate. I ran here as fast as I could." Beatrice's jaw went slack. The crimson lipstick she wore suddenly looked garish against her pale, horrified face. "Gregory, what are you doing? This man is a stowaway, and this woman is—" "Shut your mouth, Beatrice," Gregory snapped, his voice cracking with panic. It was the first time in 25 years anyone had spoken to the senior purser with such outright hostility. He turned the iPad around, shoving the screen inches from Beatrice's face. Displayed on the screen was a high-resolution photograph of Catherine Sinclair Pendleton, accompanied by a bold corporate headline, "Meridian Airlines welcomes new majority shareholder and board chairwoman." Beneath it was a secondary note, "VIP travel alert. Chairwoman Sinclair Pendleton and her husband, Mr. Charlotte Pendleton, are traveling on MA 402 to JFK today. Ensure absolute premium service." "She is the chairwoman of the board," Gregory hissed, his voice trembling with the realization that his own career was currently hanging by a thread. "She bought the parent company yesterday, and the man you just called armed police on is her husband." The words hung in the air, a death sentence for Beatrice's career. The physical transformation of the purser was dramatic. Her rigid posture collapsed. The arrogant lift of her chin vanished. She shrank back against the galley wall as if the aircraft itself were rejecting her. Richard Bridget, the ruddy-faced executive in 2B, who had demanded Charlotte be dragged out, suddenly found his financial newspaper utterly fascinating. He raised it high, trying to hide his face, his ears burning a violent shade of red. The murmurs of the other passengers shifted from indignation against Charlotte to terrified, embarrassed whispers. Charlotte slowly let go of his duffel bag. He looked up at his wife, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. He loved her fiercely, not for her money or her power, but for the uncompromising, ferocious way she protected the people she cared about. "Thank you, Catherine," Charlotte said quietly, his voice a soothing balm in the tense cabin. Catherine finally looked away from Beatrice, her expression softening instantly as she met her husband's eyes. "I told you to wait for me, my love. You know how these archaic institutions operate when they see a successful man who doesn't fit their narrow little worldview." She turned back to Gregory, the warmth vanishing from her face, replaced once more by sub-zero corporate efficiency. "Gregory," Catherine said smoothly, "I just concluded a very productive breakfast meeting with Thomas Woldby, the CEO of Heathrow. We discussed extending Meridian's gate leases and investing heavily in Terminal 5's infrastructure. It would be a profound shame if I had to call Thomas back and explain that his airport police force was weaponized against my husband due to the blatant racial profiling of my own flight crew." Officer Davis, hearing the name of the actual CEO of the entire airport dropped so casually, immediately took 3 large steps backward, physically distancing himself from Beatrice. "Ma'am, we were responding to a crew distress call. We had no idea." "I don't blame you, officer," Catherine interrupted smoothly, her tone magnanimous but firm. "You were given false information. You were told my husband was aggressive and unticketed. Both were lies manufactured by a woman who could not fathom that a black man in a sweatshirt could afford to sit in her presence." Catherine stepped directly into Beatrice's personal space. The flight attendant was trembling now, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely self-inflicted. "Did you scan his boarding pass, Beatrice?" Catherine asked, her voice dangerously quiet. It was a mistake," Beatrice whispered, tears of panic finally welling in her eyes. "The system. Sometimes there's a glitch. I was just trying to protect the integrity of the business class cabin." "The integrity of the cabin," Catherine repeated, tasting the vile excuse. "You saw a man who didn't look like your definition of wealth. You decided he was a criminal. You humiliated him in front of 50 people, and you tried to have him physically dragged onto the tarmac. You didn't make a mistake, Beatrice. You made a choice." The sheer gravity of the karma unfolding in the cabin was palpable. Every passenger who had cast a judgmental glance at Charlotte was now squirming in their wide, leather seats, painfully aware that they had backed the wrong horse. "Mrs. Sinclair Pendleton," Gregory Pierce pleaded, his hands clasped together, "please. I will personally serve Mr. Pendleton for the duration of this flight. I will comp the entire cabin's duty-free. Whatever you need to rectify this." Charlotte finally stood up. He didn't rush. He smoothed down his Yale hoodie, standing at his full 6'2" height. He commanded the space not with inherited wealth, but with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who knew his own worth. He looked at Beatrice, who couldn't even meet his gaze. She was staring at his white sneakers, completely shattered. "I don't want your apologies, Beatrice," Charlotte said, his voice echoing clearly through the silent cabin. "Apologies born out of fear of losing your job are entirely meaningless. If my wife hadn't walked through that door, you would have watched these officers put their hands on me, and you would have smiled." Charlotte turned his gaze to Richard Bridget in 2B. The executive flinched as Charlotte's eyes locked onto him. "And you, Mr. Bridget," Charlotte continued, reading the man's name off his luggage tag, "you were perfectly happy to see a man forcefully removed from a seat he paid for, simply because he was an inconvenience to your schedule. I am Charlotte Pendleton. I am the lead structural engineer for the Vanguard Spire in Manhattan and the New Horizon Tower in London. I build the offices you sit in. Next time you decide to judge a man by his clothes, remember that the world is a lot bigger than your narrow assumptions." Bridget swallowed hard, unable to formulate a single word of defense. He nodded stiffly, his face a portrait of utter humiliation. Catherine stepped beside her husband, slipping her arm through his. She looked at Gregory Pierce. "We are already 20 minutes delayed," Catherine stated, checking a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch on her wrist. "I want this aircraft in the sky, but I refuse to allow my husband to be served by a woman who views him with such absolute contempt." "Understood, ma'am," Gregory said instantly. He turned to Beatrice, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated management wrath. "Gallagher, grab your belongings from the crew rest area. You are off this flight." Beatrice's head snapped up, a choked sob escaping her lips. "Gregory, please! I have 25 years with Meridian, my pension. You can't just throw me off the plane. The union will. You created a massive liability for this airline. You are not just off this flight, Beatrice. You are suspended pending a full board review. And as the chairwoman of that board, I can assure you, your career in the sky ended the moment you told my husband he didn't belong." Beatrice looked around wildly for an ally. She looked at Simon, the young flight attendant, who immediately looked at the floor. She looked at the passengers, who actively turned their heads away. She had built her entire identity on being the gatekeeper for the elite, and the elite had just discarded her like trash. Sobbing openly now, her perfect chignon coming undone, Beatrice stumbled toward the forward galley. She grabbed her rolling suitcase, her hands shaking violently. Officer Davis stepped aside to let her pass, his face impassive. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, using the exact same authoritative tone he had been about to use on Charlotte. "We'll escort you back to the terminal." The poetic justice of the moment was profound. Beatrice Gallagher, who had smugly summoned security to perp-walk an innocent black man off the plane, was now being escorted off her own aircraft by those very same officers. The heavy thud of her sensible crew shoes retreating down the jet bridge was the only sound in the cabin. Once she was gone, Gregory Pierce let out a long, shaky breath and turned to the young flight attendant. "Simon, you are acting purser for this flight. Get the doors closed. Serve the vintage champagne. Do not make a single mistake." Simon nodded frantically. "Yes, Mr. Pierce. Right away, sir." Gregory turned back to Charlotte and Catherine, bowing slightly once more. "Again, my deepest apologies. Have a safe flight to New York." As Gregory hurried off the plane and the heavy cabin door sealed shut, Catherine finally sank into seat 2C, right across the aisle from Charlotte. She let out a soft sigh, the terrifying corporate warlord persona melting away to reveal the exhausted wife underneath. Charlotte leaned across the aisle and took her hand. "You didn't have to buy the whole airline just to get me a good seat, you know." Catherine let out a genuine, musical laugh, squeezing his hand. "Well, darling, I saw the Q3 financials. It was a good investment. Firing racists is just a delightful fringe benefit." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Simon appeared beside them, his hands trembling slightly as he presented a silver tray holding 2 crystal flutes of Dom Perignon. "For you, Mr. Pendleton," Simon said softly, his eyes filled with respect. "And for you, Mrs. Sinclair Pendleton. I am so sorry I didn't speak up earlier." Charlotte took the glass, offering the young man a gentle, forgiving smile. "It takes time to learn how to stand up to bullies, Simon. Just make sure you do it next time." The plane taxied toward the runway, leaving London and Beatrice Gallagher's ruined career far behind them. But the story of what happened on Flight 402 was only just beginning to ripple out, and the hard karma was about to get much, much worse for those who thought they were untouchable. The remaining 7 hours of Meridian Airlines Flight 402 to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport were a masterclass in suffocating, luxurious awkwardness. For Charlotte and Catherine, the flight was a peaceful sanctuary. Simon, the newly minted acting purser, provided service that bordered on the reverent. The champagne never dipped below the halfway mark. The warm mixed nuts were perpetually refreshed, and the Michelin-starred catering was plated with trembling perfection. For the rest of the business class cabin, however, the transatlantic journey was an exercise in agonizing self-reflection. The wealthy elite who had blindly supported Beatrice's blatant profiling now sat rigid in their plush leather pods. Every time Charlotte stood up to stretch his legs, the surrounding passengers suddenly found the stitching on their blankets incredibly fascinating. Richard Bridget, the ruddy-faced executive in 2B, was having an exceptionally miserable time. He had ordered 3 double scotches in rapid succession, trying to drown out the burning shame that radiated from his own pores. He was the senior partner at Bridget Atherton Capital, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm based in Manhattan. He was used to his voice commanding respect. Today, his voice had aligned him with a humiliated racist, and he had been publicly dressed down by the lead engineer of the Vanguard Spire, a man whose architectural genius Bridget's own firm had literally just bid to finance. Bridget closed his eyes, praying the incident would simply evaporate into the pressurized cabin air, a momentary lapse of judgment forgotten upon landing. He was violently, catastrophically wrong. 4 rows back, in seat 4F, sat a man named David Kensington. David was a senior investigative journalist for a major international tech and culture publication. He was not dressed in a bespoke suit, nor did he possess the loud, arrogant entitlement of Richard Bridget. David was a quiet observer, and more importantly, David possessed a smartphone equipped with a highly stabilized 4K camera. When Beatrice Gallagher had first approached Charlotte and initiated her hostile interrogation, David had instantly sensed the sickeningly familiar rhythm of racial profiling. He had quietly propped his phone against the lip of his tray table, angling the lens perfectly down the aisle. He had recorded the entire interaction. He captured Beatrice's sneering condescension. He captured her physical blocking of the aisle. He captured her blatant lies about the ticketing system, her weaponization of the security officers, and the terrifying, triumphant entrance of Catherine Sinclair Pendleton. Crucially, the high-definition microphone had flawlessly picked up Richard Bridget's booming, aristocratic voice demanding that the unhinged stowaway be dragged out. While the rest of the cabin slept or stared blankly at their seatback screens, David Kensington paid the $22 for Meridian Airlines premium in-flight Wi-Fi. He didn't just upload the video. He crafted a meticulous, devastatingly accurate thread. He broke down the subtle mechanics of Beatrice's discrimination, how she bypassed Charlotte for a drink, how she used trigger words like aggressive and threatened to manipulate armed police, and how the affluent white passengers instinctively weaponized their own privilege against a lone black man. David hit post while the aircraft was somewhere over the frozen expanse of Greenland. The internet is a volatile, unpredictable beast, but it possesses an insatiable appetite for undeniable, high-definition injustice, especially when that injustice is followed by instantaneous, spectacular corporate karma. By the time Flight 402 began its descent over the eastern seaboard of the United States, the video had amassed 4 million views. By the time the landing gear locked into place, it had crossed 10 million. The hashtags number Meridian Airlines, number Flight 402, and number Seat 2A were trending globally at numbers 1, 2, and 3. People were not just angry, they were forensic. The digital mob quickly crowdsourced the identities of everyone involved. They identified Beatrice from her name tag. But worse, much worse for the man in Seat 2B, financial journalists on X, formerly Twitter, instantly recognized the booming voice and ruddy profile of Richard Bridget. The wheels of the Boeing 777 kissed the tarmac at JFK. The thrust reversers roared, bringing the massive aircraft to a gentle halt. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York," Simon announced over the PA, his voice steady and professional. "You may now take your devices off airplane mode." The symphony of incoming notifications that erupted in the business class cabin was deafening. In Seat 2B, Richard Bridget turned on his iPhone. It immediately froze, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming data. When the screen finally refreshed, he saw 74 missed calls, over 200 text messages, and a frantic all-caps email from his firm's head of public relations with the subject line, "Emergency Crisis Management. Do not leave the airport." Bridget's blood turned to ice. He opened a text from his junior partner, "Richard, what the hell did you do?" "CNBC just ran the video. We are losing limited partners by the minute. His hands trembling uncontrollably, Bridget opened his web browser. There it was, his own face, his own voice, forever immortalized on the internet, loudly advocating for the forceful removal of an innocent black man. He looked across the aisle at Charlotte Pendleton, who was calmly unbuckling his seatbelt and retrieving his Yale hoodie. Bridget felt physically ill. The bubble of his untouchable wealth had just been violently popped by the very technology he used to monitor his stock portfolios. Catherine Sinclair Pendleton's phone was equally busy, but for entirely different reasons. As she connected to the American cellular networks, her screen lit up with messages from the Meridian Airlines Board of Directors, legal teams, and public relations executives. She read a message from the airline's newly frantic CEO, offering his immediate resignation. Catherine typed a cool, measured reply. "Your resignation is not accepted. We have a systemic issue to root out. Meet me at the Manhattan office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring Gallagher's entire employment file." She slipped the phone back into her Birkin bag and smiled at her husband. "Well, darling, it appears our little delay at Heathrow made the evening news." Charlotte sighed, shouldering his canvas duffel bag. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired of a world that constantly demanded he prove his right to exist in premium spaces. "I just wanted to get home, Kath. Now it's a circus." "It's not a circus, Charlotte," Catherine corrected softly, her green eyes flashing with protective fire. "It's an autopsy. They are finally going to see the rot." 72 hours after Meridian Airlines Flight 402 touched down in New York, the corporate guillotine dropped in London. Beatrice Gallagher sat shivering in the frigid, glass-walled conference room of the airline's flagship headquarters near Heathrow Airport. She was accompanied by a visibly sweating union representative, Thomas Harris, who kept nervously checking his watch. Across the sprawling oak table sat Catherine Sinclair Pendleton, flanked by 3 terrifyingly silent corporate attorneys from Clifford Chance, one of London's most ruthless and effective law firms. Beatrice looked completely hollowed out. The public humiliation of the last 3 days had violently shattered her pristine, aristocratic facade. The British tabloids, notorious for their viciousness, had camped outside her semi-detached home in Surrey. They had splashed her face across the front pages under damning, inescapable headlines like "The Purser of Prejudice" and "Flight 402 to Bigotry." "Mrs. Sinclair Pendleton, my client acknowledges a grave lapse in judgment," Thomas Harris began, his voice lacking any real conviction. He nervously slid a piece of paper forward. "She has served this airline faithfully for 25 years. We believe a 6-month unpaid suspension, paired with mandatory bias and sensitivity training, is a proportionate and fair response." Catherine didn't speak immediately. She slowly opened a thick, red-tabbed manila folder resting on the polished wood. The silence in the room stretched until Beatrice looked like she might physically be sick. 25 years, Catherine finally murmured, her tone deceptively soft as she flipped a page. "Tell me, Beatrice, what precisely is a Code 4 baggage anomaly in the Meridian Staff Handbook?" Beatrice flinched, her eyes darting to Eris, who suddenly looked very rigid. It's a standard security protocol, ma'am. If a passenger's carry-on looks oversized, or if their behavior warrants additional screening, we flag them for a gate check." Catherine nodded slowly, tracing a line on the paper with a manicured fingernail. "I had our IT department run a forensic audit on your specific flight logs over the last decade. It turns out you have invoked the Code 4 protocol 182 times in the business class cabin." Catherine looked up, her piercing green eyes pinning Beatrice to the chair. 179 of those passengers were people of color. The other 3 were Middle Eastern. Thomas Harris slowly closed his notepad, capped his pen, and pushed his chair back a fraction of an inch. He recognized a sinking ship when he saw one, and he was absolutely not about to drown his union's reputation for Beatrice Gallagher. "You didn't make a mistake with my husband," Catherine stated, her voice devoid of anger, which somehow made the delivery vastly more terrifying. "You operated a localized, deeply personal system of racial segregation within the cabins of this airline for over a decade." You used your manufactured authority to systematically harass and humiliate minorities who dared to fly in the spaces you deemed exclusive. Your bigotry is not a lapse in judgment. It is a quantifiable, legally documented liability. The sheer finality of the statement hung in the sterile air of the room. Beatrice had spent 2.5 decades building her entire identity around the navy blue uniform of Meridian Airlines. She had viewed herself as the ultimate gatekeeper of the sky, untouchable in her seniority, protected by her tenure. Now, that delusion was shattering into a million jagged pieces. I was protecting the brand, Beatrice whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks, clinging to the last, desperate defense of a ruined worldview. I gave my life to this airline. I own the brand, Catherine countered smoothly. And you are officially terminated, effective immediately. For gross, documented misconduct, which legally nullifies your severance package and triggers a punitive clause severely impacting your corporate pension withdrawal limits. We are also forwarding this dossier to the Civil Aviation Authority. You will never work in the sky again. You may leave. Beatrice broke down into heavy, ragged sobs, burying her face in her trembling hands. There was no pity in the room. Catherine simply watched her go, a surgeon satisfied that a toxic tumor had been successfully excised. 3,000 miles away, high above the bustling streets of Manhattan, an entirely different corporate execution was taking place. Richard Bridget sat at the head of the long marble table in the boardroom of Bridget Atherton Capital. The panoramic views of the New York skyline, usually a source of immense pride, now felt like the bars of a gilded cage. Surrounding him were the firm's 8 senior partners. Their faces were uniformly grim, displaying the specific kind of anger reserved for men who were losing millions of dollars by the minute. The Vanguard Spire project is dead, Richard, the managing partner, a ruthless man named Harrison Caldwell, said flatly. Charlotte Pendleton's engineering firm just officially withdrew their structural certification for the development if our firm remains the primary financier. The city developers panicked. They dropped us entirely. We just lost a $400 million anchor deal because of your mouth. The societal fallout had been just as swift and merciless. His wife, a prominent socialite who chaired 3 major charity galas, had moved into their Hamptons estate the moment the video aired on CNN, refusing to take his calls. The prestigious country club they had belonged to for 15 years had quietly suspended his membership pending an internal behavioral review. His empire was turning to ash. Richard rubbed his eyes, his ruddy face pale, the arrogance stripped away by 3 sleepless nights. It was an airplane spat, Harrison. Pendleton is being vindictive over a simple misunderstanding. We can sue for breach of contract. A misunderstanding? Harrison barked, slamming his palm flat against the marble. You told armed Heathrow police to drag the most sought-after structural engineer in North America off a plane because he was wearing a hoodie while black. The video has 38 million views. The New York State Common Retirement Fund just called me personally. They are freezing their capital commitments. They cannot and will not have their ESG funds tied to a firm whose senior partner is the face of viral, undeniable racism. I built this firm, Richard shouted, his entitlement flaring one last, desperate time. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at his partners. You can't do this over a 20-second video clip taken out of context. We already did, Harrison replied coldly, sliding a single, legally binding sheet of paper across the table. This is your resignation letter. You are stepping down immediately for undisclosed health reasons. You will surrender your voting shares at a 30% discount. I will fight this in court, Richard seethed. If you fight this, Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, the board will vote to terminate you with cause under the morality clause of your foundational partnership agreement. The PR firm has already drafted the press release condemning your actions. If we fire you with cause, you walk away with 0 equity, nothing. You will be toxic to every bank on Wall Street. Sign the paper, Richard. Richard Bridget stared at the document. The booming, aristocratic voice that had echoed through the business-class cabin demanding a man be thrown out like trash, was completely gone. In its place was the hollow, terrifying silence of a man who suddenly realized that his money and his tailored suits could no longer insulate him from the catastrophic consequences of his own cruelty. With a shaking hand, he picked up his Mont Blanc pen and signed his professional life away. That evening, Charlotte and Catherine sat on the wind-swept terrace of their Tribeca penthouse, the city lights glittering below them like scattered diamonds against the dark canvas of the night. Charlotte was nursing a crystal glass of aged bourbon, the deep tension of the past week finally bleeding out of his broad shoulders. He hadn't actively sought revenge. He hadn't asked Catherine to destroy Beatrice, nor had he demanded his firm drop the Bridget Atherton deal. He had simply refused to hide the ugly truth. When his firm's internal ethics committee asked why he was suddenly uncomfortable with the Vanguard Spire financing, he simply provided them with the unedited video link. The crushing weight of consequence had taken care of the rest. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked gently, stepping out onto the terrace. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. Charlotte looked out at the illuminated skyline. He could see the skeletal, steel framework of the new towers he was helping to build, massive structures specifically designed to withstand immense pressure and stand tall against gale-force winds. "I'm all right," Charlotte smiled softly, reaching back to cover her hand with his own. "I just hope the next time a tired guy in a hoodie walks onto a plane, they let him drink his champagne in peace." The incident on Meridian Airlines Flight 402 became a watershed moment in corporate accountability, forever altering the landscape of premium travel. Beatrice Gallagher's catastrophic decision to weaponize her authority against Charlotte Pendleton systematically dismantled her own life, leaving her stripped of her prestigious career and financial security. Richard Bridget, blinded by his own arrogant privilege, found that his immense wealth was entirely useless against the swift, unforgiving judgment of public exposure, resulting in his disgraceful ousting from the empire he helped build. Ultimately, the story is not just about the swiftness of modern karma, but the quiet, unshakable dignity of Charlotte, who weathered the storm of public humiliation without ever compromising his integrity. Accompanied by Catherine's ferocious, calculated loyalty, their response proved that true power does not lie in performative wealth or loud cruelty, but in the steadfast refusal to let the prejudiced assumptions of others dictate your worth.